I heard the sentence before I even saw who said it. A sharp, low whisper cutting through the clatter of dishes behind me. I had just set my coffee down when the words landed in my ear, close enough that I felt the breath of them. My first reaction was simple confusion, just a small shift in my chest. But something in the tone made the air feel heavier. Then I recognized the voice, and the meaning changed. My nephew said, "He'll be gone before payday," like it was a fact already decided. I sat in the corner booth I'd been coming to for years, tucked against the wall where the noise usually faded. The place was calm that afternoon, only a few tables filled, no music playing. I had come for an early lunch, nothing more. But once that sentence hit me, the quiet turned into something else. Tight, watchful, too still. I didn't turn around right away. I needed a second to be sure I'd really heard him. When I finally looked, my nephew was leaning forward in the booth near the hallway to the restrooms. His girlfriend sat across from him, her shoulders pulled in and her eyes fixed on the table. She looked like she wanted to be somewhere else. He didn't see me. He was too focused on whatever he was explaining, his hands moving in small, nervous gestures, like he was calculating something in the air. I watched him for only a moment, and that was enough to raise the hairs on my arms. The tone he used wasn't casual. It wasn't a joke or a complaint. It was too steady, too cold. I couldn't make out the rest of the conversation, but the girlfriend's reaction told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't confused. She wasn't laughing. She was scared. A waiter passing by slowed when he heard my nephew's voice. He didn't stop, but he hesitated long enough to show he'd caught something he didn't like. His eyes flicked toward me, then back toward their table like he was trying to piece together what he'd overheard. I remembered that waiter. He'd served me plenty of times. The look he gave wasn't friendly curiosity. It was concern, a quiet signal that something was wrong. I kept my breathing steady and tried to focus on the simple facts in front of me. My nephew was here. He wasn't expecting me. He said someone would be gone before payday, and he said it with a confidence that felt dangerous. I told myself there could be other explanations, but the way his girlfriend flinched shut that thought down before it could settle. She didn't lift her eyes once. She looked like someone waiting for a door to close behind her. I tried to catch more of the conversation, but the restaurant sounds swallowed their words. A tray clattered near the kitchen. Someone laughed too loudly at another table. A chair scraped across the floor. All the usual noises, but they felt distant, like I was listening through a wall. The only clear sound left in my head was that one sentence, repeating with a shape that grew sharper every time. I thought about it. I didn't finish my coffee. I didn't touch my food. I kept my movement slow as I stood up, mostly because I didn't trust my legs to stay steady. The waiter glanced at me again, and there was something in his expression that made me sure he'd heard enough to worry. He didn't approach me, but he didn't look away either. When I stepped outside, the air felt cooler than it should have. My hands were stiff, and a dull pressure sat behind my ribs. I tried to reason with myself, to find some normal explanation, but nothing fit. Not the tone, not the girlfriend's face, not the waiter's reaction. The sentence stayed lodged in my mind like a nail driven too deep. I walked to my car with a knot tightening low in my stomach, each step heavier than the last. I didn't have proof of anything yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. That sentence wasn't meant for me to hear, and whatever it meant, it wasn't harmless. I drove home slowly that afternoon, letting the road pull me forward even while my mind stayed stuck on the restaurant booth behind me. The farther I got from that place, the more old memories began to surface, each one brushing against the words I'd overheard. I'd known my nephew since the day he was born. For most of his life, I thought of him as someone I could count on. But over the past few years, our closeness had thinned, stretched by a long line of financial requests that kept growing in size and frequency. I didn't realize how much that shift bothered me until the quiet in my house made it impossible to ignore. After my wife passed, the house felt too big for one person, and I filled the silence by focusing on routines, small tasks, daily walks, simple meals. Then my surgery came along last winter and changed even those. Recovery hadn't been easy. I moved slower, tired quicker, and relied on a cane longer than I wanted to admit. It didn't take long before my nephew started stepping in, offering to help manage things until I was stronger. At first, it felt like kindness, a family gesture. But looking back, it also opened doors I hadn't meant to open. He started showing up more often than usual, sometimes with groceries, sometimes empty-handed, always staying just long enough to ask how I was feeling and whether I needed help with anything involving money. He'd offer to sort my bills, move funds around, take the pressure off. I said no each time, lightly, politely, but he never stopped trying. I should have paid more attention to that persistence. There were signs he was struggling. His job changed twice in a single year. I overheard him arguing on the phone about overdue payments. And once, when he thought I wasn't looking, I saw a printed list of online betting odds folded inside his jacket. I didn't judge him for it. Everyone has their battles. But his smile had become tighter, his shoulders more tense, as if something heavy was pressing down on him. Small doubts grew after that. He started asking questions he never used to ask, casual on the surface, but strange. Things like how much my insurance covered or what kind of savings I kept just in case. He asked about my pension one day when he was supposed to be helping me bring in groceries. He laughed it off as curiosity, but his eyes didn't match the smile. They darted, calculating, as if he was trying to solve a problem that had nothing to do with me. His girlfriend came around a few times. She was polite, quiet, and always seemed to hover near the doorway, like she didn't want to sit for too long. Whenever the topic of money came up, usually brought up by him, she would look down or shift in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly against her leg. I hadn't understood it then. I just assumed she was shy or uncomfortable knowing I was still recovering from surgery. But now, after hearing that sentence in the restaurant, her silence made more sense. It wasn't shyness, it was worry. The pieces didn't fall into place all at once. They slid together slowly, like parts of a picture forming on their own. His repeated offers to manage my finances, his stress about money, his strange questions, her uneasy glances. They had all been small flags I ignored or explained away. But the sentence I heard that afternoon, sharp, cold, and spoken with certainty, pulled all those moments into a single line I couldn't pretend not to see anymore. I sat down in my living room and let the weight of it settle. The house felt different, as if it knew something had shifted. My nephew's voice replayed in my head, each repetition pressing against the small doubts that had been piling up for months. None of those signs had meant danger before. But now, tied to that one sentence, they felt like warnings I should have noticed sooner. The morning after the restaurant incident, I turned on my computer with a feeling I couldn't shake, like something was waiting for me in the background. I logged into my bank account the way I always did, slow and careful, making sure I didn't miss any details. The page loaded normally, but a small red banner at the top caught my eye. It said there had been an attempted login at 2 in the morning from a device I didn't recognize. I stared at the timestamp, trying to remember if I'd been awake, but I knew I hadn't. My accounts had always been quiet, predictable. Seeing that alert broke something loose inside me, something cold. Later that day, my nephew showed up without calling. He used his usual line, just checking in, but the timing felt off. He walked through the house like he was looking for something, even though he asked the same surface questions he always did. He kept glancing toward my desk, toward the stack of mail I hadn't sorted yet. I kept my voice steady, but inside, I was watching every move he made with a new kind of awareness. Nothing he did was loud or obvious, but everything felt slightly shifted, like there was another layer under his visit I wasn't supposed to see. 2 days later, he offered to drive me to the pharmacy. It was a short trip, and I didn't want to make a scene, so I agreed. When he stepped out to pick up a drink at the convenience store next door, I stayed in the passenger seat and let my eyes drift around the car. That's when I noticed a bank envelope tucked halfway under the seat, the logo matching the one on all my statements. It was old enough to be worn at the edges, but still sealed. I didn't touch it. I just let the sight burn into my memory. That envelope didn't belong in his car. He didn't even use my bank. I brought up the restaurant incident to his girlfriend a week later, gently, as if I wasn't sure what I'd heard. She stiffened immediately. Her eyes dropped to the floor, and she forced a smile that didn't hold. She didn't ask what I meant or how much I'd overheard. She didn't say anything at all. Her silence told me more than any explanation could have. Whatever my nephew had told her, it was enough to keep her quiet. He came by again the next afternoon. This time he didn't bother trying to hide his frustration. He pushed the power of attorney forms across my table with a tone that pretended to be helpful, but carried a clear impatience underneath. He said it would make things simple. He said I was making life harder than it needed to be. His foot tapped the floor. His jaw stayed tight. I kept my answer calm and firm, and the way his eyes hardened told me he hadn't expected resistance. The final piece slid into place a few days later when my neighbor mentioned something in passing. She said she'd seen my nephew near my mailbox earlier in the week when I wasn't home. She assumed he was doing me a favor, but she mentioned it casually, not knowing she'd just tugged on the same thread I'd been pulling for days. I kept my reaction neutral. Inside, though, a quiet line had been crossed. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and opened a small notebook I hadn't used in years. I wrote down the login attempt, the unannounced visits, the envelope in the car, his girlfriend's silence, the pressure for signatures, the mailbox. Each entry felt like a step I couldn't take back from. I wasn't ready to accuse him of anything, not out loud, but I needed a record, something steady I could rely on if things continued to shift in the wrong direction. As I closed the notebook, the house settled around me with a weight I hadn't felt before. Doubt wasn't a passing thought anymore. It had become a shadow that followed me from room to room, growing sharper every time he showed up at my door. I went back to the restaurant 2 days later, walking in with the same steady pace I always used, even though my mind was anything but steady. The place looked the same. Dim lights, quiet booths, the faint smell of coffee and lemon cleaner, but it felt different now. I wasn't there for lunch. I was there to follow a thread I couldn't ignore. I took a seat at the counter instead of my usual booth so I could see who was working. When the waiter from that afternoon came out from the kitchen, he spotted me almost immediately. His expression shifted just slightly, like he'd been expecting this. He walked over with a calm he clearly practiced, but there was a hint of tension in his shoulders. I kept my voice low and told him I had overheard part of a conversation recently, one involving my nephew. I didn't accuse anyone, didn't push, just gave him room to respond. He looked around as if checking who could hear us, then leaned in a little closer. His words were quiet, plain. He said my nephew had sounded off, his exact word, and that he'd recorded the conversation because something about it didn't sit right with him. I didn't react outwardly. I only nodded once, steady, letting him know I understood the weight of what he was telling me. He slipped his phone from his apron pocket and pressed play without handing it over. The recording was muffled in places, but the key parts were painfully clear. My nephew mentioned timelines in a tone that carried no hesitation. He talked about insurance, like it was already guaranteed. He said he was broke until payday, and the frustration in his voice made the hairs on the back of my neck lift. Hearing it confirmed what I'd been trying not to assume. The conversation wasn't about a bill or a debt or someone else. It was about me. I listened while keeping my breathing even, only allowing myself one small exhale once the audio stopped. The waiter studied my face, maybe expecting anger or shock, but all I felt was a heavy, cold certainty settling into place. He told me quietly that the girlfriend had looked scared during the conversation, really scared, and that it wasn't the kind of fear that comes from an argument. It was the kind that comes from knowing something you wish you didn't. I thanked him without asking for a copy. I didn't need one yet. I needed clarity more than evidence. I stepped out of the restaurant and paused on the sidewalk, letting the outside air ground me. The city noises felt distant, like they were happening behind a thick window. My nephew's voice from the recording played over in my mind, each word fitting into the gaps left by the past few months. It wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It wasn't coincidence. It was direction. When I got home, I moved through the house with a clear purpose. I collected every important document, my insurance papers, bank statements, ID cards, and stored them in a small lockbox I kept hidden in my bedroom closet. I changed my passwords carefully, one by one, writing each new one in a coded form only I would understand. I made sure my laptop was logged out of everything, and I checked my phone settings with a patience I didn't know I had. Nothing dramatic, nothing paranoid, just controlled steps to make sure I wasn't offering easy access to anyone. The next morning, I called my bank and scheduled a private appointment. I asked for it to be in person, not over the phone, and requested to meet with someone I trusted. They gave me a time later in the week. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. The tone I used was enough. As I hung up, the house fell quiet again, but not with the same kind of silence as before. This one carried direction, an understanding that I was moving from doubt into action. The recording had answered the question I'd been too cautious to voice, and now I needed to make sure nothing in my life was left unprotected. The banker greeted me with the usual polite warmth, But the moment we sat down in her small office, the air shifted. She opened my file on her screen, and I watched her expression tighten in a way she tried to hide. She didn't waste time. She told me there had been several recent attempts to access my accounts, different devices, different times of day, each one blocked only because the security questions weren't answered correctly. The pattern wasn't random. Someone had tried again and again, like they were guessing pieces of my life. Hearing it spoken out loud hit harder than the alert I'd seen online. It meant someone was actively trying to get in. Then she showed me something worse. A beneficiary update request had been submitted the previous week. The form had my name on it, my address, my birthday, but the handwriting wasn't mine. It looked like someone had tried to copy my script by memory, just close enough to pass a quick glance, but sloppy around the curves of the letters. She slid the page closer so I could see it. The signature at the bottom didn't look like my hand at all. I kept my breathing even as I studied the strokes. There was a strange kind of calm that came over me while I looked at that forged line. It wasn't anger, it was recognition, an understanding that the doubt I'd been carrying had just turned into something solid. Someone wasn't just making attempts, they were planning for a result. As I left the bank, the weight of it settled across my shoulders. The street felt colder than it should have. On the walk back to my car, I checked my phone and saw a message from an unknown number. It was short. "We need to talk. It's about him." No name, no explanation. But I knew who it was. My nephew's girlfriend had always looked nervous. Now I understood why. We met in the parking lot behind the grocery store that evening. She stayed inside her car with the door cracked open just enough for her voice to carry. Her hands shook as she held the steering wheel. She didn't waste time with greetings. She said my nephew had told her things she didn't want to hear, things she'd tried to ignore until the fear got too heavy. The worst part came out in a whisper, the kind that wasn't dramatic or emotional, but tired, like she'd rehearsed it too many times. She said he told her, "Everything will be settled soon. He won't be around to stop it." The words didn't feel real at first. They hung there between us, cold and heavy, as if they needed room to land. She wouldn't look at me when she said them. She stared at her knees, eyes wide, like she expected those words to echo back at her all over again. I asked nothing. I didn't want to push her. She was scared enough already. She added that he'd been sinking deeper into debt, gambling, borrowing, scrambling for cash he didn't have. His payday was coming up in a matter of days, and he'd said he needed things cleared up before then. The timeline matched everything I'd been piecing together. The restaurant sentence, the recording, the login attempts, the forged form, the questions about insurance. None of it was random. It wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a plan. By the time I got home, the house felt unfamiliar, like the walls were listening. I sat down in the living room and let the truth settle. My nephew wasn't just desperate. He wasn't just making poor decisions. The direction of his choices pointed somewhere darker. I wasn't dealing with simple financial pressure anymore. I was dealing with someone who had decided I was standing in his way, and for the first time, the thought crossed my mind without hesitation. I might be in real physical danger. The next morning, my phone buzzed before sunrise. It was the girlfriend again, this time sending screenshots without any introduction. Each image showed a message from my nephew, pieces of conversations that made my stomach tighten. He talked about insurance money, like it was already his. He complained about being stuck broke until payday. He wrote that things needed to happen before the week ends. There was no subtlety in the tone, just the blunt impatience of someone who believed he was owed something. She didn't add any explanation. She didn't need to. The screenshots spoke for themselves. I saved the images and drove to my doctor's office, hoping for something that made sense, something rational. Instead, what I got closed the last gap between worry and proof. My doctor stepped into the exam room with a look I hadn't seen on him before. Measured concern, the kind he usually saved for dangerous lab results. He asked if I had approved any medication changes recently. When I told him I hadn't, he let out a slow breath and said someone had tried to adjust my prescriptions through the patient portal. They requested a stronger dosage of one medication and the discontinuation of another, both changes that could have harmed me if they'd gone through. I felt something cold settle in my chest as he explained the timestamps. The requests had come from my old laptop, the one I'd given my nephew access to during my recovery, back when I needed help paying bills online. The login had remained, stored in the browser. I remembered watching him sit at that computer more than once, telling me he was updating software or organizing files. I realized then that he had been looking for more than just old photos or downloads. I left the clinic with the weight of that discovery sitting across my shoulders. As I reached the parking lot, I called the waiter from the restaurant and asked if he could meet me for a few minutes. He agreed without hesitation. We sat in his car behind the restaurant, windows slightly fogged from the cold. He handed me his phone and told me he was giving me the full audio, not just the clipped part I'd heard earlier. He said he thought it might matter now. The recording played through the speakers in a flat, unfiltered tone. My nephew sounded calm, almost methodical. He talked about timelines again, but now he said something else, something sharper. He said, "He's too weak to fight anything now." My hand tightened around the phone. Hearing that line stripped away the last pieces of doubt. This wasn't carelessness. It wasn't stress. It wasn't desperation alone. He'd assessed my physical condition like it was an opening. I didn't raise my voice, didn't swear, didn't react in any way that would make the waiter uncomfortable. I simply thanked him and told him he'd done the right thing. Then I drove straight to the office of an attorney I trusted, someone who had guided me through legal matters after my wife passed. I walked in with the screenshots, the forged beneficiary form, the audio clip, and the doctor's warning. I wasn't looking for drama. I wanted clarity. When I finished laying it all out, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said the words I already knew, but needed to hear spoken directly. He told me this wasn't just financial misconduct. It was attempted elder exploitation. And based on the medication request and the tone of the conversations, it might involve planning bodily harm. The room felt smaller after he said it, but his calm voice kept me steady. He advised me not to be alone with my nephew anymore, not under any circumstances. He said we would prepare the right steps, methodical and documented, but warned that I needed to treat the situation as active danger. Not panic, not fear, but preparedness. A clear, careful distance. As I left his office, the hallway lights felt too bright, the air too thin. I had walked in, hoping for guidance. I walked out knowing the stakes had shifted again, this time into something I couldn't ignore or downplay. Whatever came next, I needed to be ready. The attorney didn't waste time once he understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. He made a few calls while I sat across from his desk, listening to the low murmur of his voice as he spoke with people who knew how to handle situations like this. When he hung up, he said the plan would be simple and controlled. Authorities would monitor the next move, waiting for my nephew to make the push he'd been circling for weeks. They wouldn't intervene early, and they wouldn't make a scene. They needed him to show intent. My job was to stay steady, follow the steps, and not let him sense the shift. That afternoon, I sent my nephew a short message telling him I was ready to talk about the papers. I used his wording, the same vague phrasing he always used. Within minutes, he replied with an enthusiasm that felt out of place considering everything he'd been pressuring me for. He said he would come by soon, said he had the documents printed and ready, said it was the smart thing to do. The eagerness in his response wasn't comforting. It was a sign of desperation. Over the next day, his behavior grew sharper. He started texting more, checking in at odd hours, asking if I'd changed my mind or if I needed him to bring anything when he came. Each message felt like he was trying to push me toward a corner. I answered calmly, never offering too much detail, keeping the same older man patience he expected from me. If he sensed even a hint of distance, the plan would fall apart. The girlfriend reached out again late that night. She said she wanted to help, not because she felt brave, but because the fear had become too much to carry alone. She admitted she'd spent weeks trying to talk him down, trying to convince him to slow down, to get help, to rethink what he was doing. She said he was past listening. The pressure of his debt had twisted him into someone she barely recognized. Her voice trembled as she talked, but she stayed on the line until she knew I wasn't going to back out of the plan. Authorities gave me their instructions the following morning. They told me to keep the communication open, to let him make the final push, to let him believe I was giving him exactly what he wanted. They said they'd be close enough to step in the moment he crossed the line. They emphasized calm movements, no unexpected improvisation, no provoking him. Just let the moment unfold while they watched. I spent the afternoon preparing the house. It wasn't about building traps or anything dramatic. It was about control. I placed a small camera near the entryway, where it wouldn't be noticed. I locked away my medications in a drawer he didn't know about. I removed every financial document from the desk drawers and stored them in the lockbox. I made sure my phone stayed fully charged and within reach. Every step was deliberate, steady, the kind of preparation that comes from understanding the seriousness of a situation instead of fearing it. When I finished, the house felt different, quiet but ready. I stood in the living room, letting the silence settle. The cane rested beside my hand. The late afternoon light stretched across the floor, long and thin. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to clarity. I wasn't walking into this blindly anymore. Just before sunset, my nephew texted again. He said he was coming over that evening. He didn't ask if the time worked for me. He didn't offer options or explanations. He said he needed me to sign everything so we can get this done before payday. The push was unmistakable now. The timeline he had built was closing around him, and he wanted to lock everything into place. I sent back a simple reply, telling him I'd be home. As soon as I hit send, the tension in the air shifted. The house, the plan, the long trail of signs, all of it drew into a single point. The meeting was set, and the moment he walked through the door, everything would come into the open. He showed up right after dark, walking up the path with a speed that didn't match his forced smile when I opened the door. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and laid a stack of documents on the dining table like he was setting down a winning hand. His fingers tapped against the top page, a restless, impatient rhythm. He said we needed to sign everything tonight. He said delays were making things messy. His voice sounded stretched thin, and the edge hiding underneath it wasn't subtle. I sat down across from him, my cane resting beside my chair. He pushed the documents toward me. Beneficiary forms, power of attorney papers, financial authorizations. The signatures were marked with yellow tabs. He pointed to each one as if he'd rehearsed the order. I didn't touch a single page. I let him talk, let him build his own pressure. When he finally paused long enough to breathe, I asked him one question. Quiet, steady, without accusation. I asked what he meant at the restaurant when he said I'd be gone before payday. His face changed instantly. The mask slipped. The irritation he'd been hiding cracked open into something sharper. He asked who told me. He asked who else knew. The way he said the words wasn't loud, but the tension behind them filled the room. He leaned forward, jaw tight, eyes locked on mine with a mix of anger and panic. He said I was taking too long, that things needed to be handled, that he couldn't wait forever while I dragged my feet. I didn't react. I didn't raise my voice. I held his stare and let the silence force him into the next move. Under that pressure, he snapped. He said I didn't understand the situation. He said he needed the money now, not months from now. Then he lowered his voice and muttered that I wasn't strong enough to fight any of this anyway. The words landed heavy, but not surprising. Behind him, the front door eased open an inch. Quiet footsteps shifted near the hallway. He didn't notice. His girlfriend stood just inside the frame, her phone raised slightly, recording. Her hands trembled, but she held it steady enough to capture every word. She caught my eye for a second, a silent reassurance that she was there, doing exactly what she'd promised. My nephew's frustration escalated fast. He shoved the papers closer, the pages, sliding across the table. He demanded I sign. He said he needed everything finalized, tonight. The timeline that had been circling the edges of every conversation finally exposed itself without disguise. When I didn't move, he reached across the table as if he meant to grab my hand or the pen beside it. That was all it took. Authorities stepped in from both directions, one from the front hallway, one from the kitchen entrance. Calm, firm, controlled. They told him to step back. They told him to keep his hands visible. He froze for half a second before the panic set in. But by then, it didn't matter. He wasn't going anywhere. They asked him about the documents, about the signatures, about his involvement. His answers stumbled over each other, falling apart faster than he could piece them together. While they questioned him, the girlfriend held out her phone. The officer listened to the recording she'd captured. His own words, clean and undeniable. Then the waiter's audio played next. My nephew heard himself describing timelines, insurance money, and my health as if it were a hurdle he expected to clear. The impact of hearing his own voice stripped away whatever excuses he might have tried to build. Within minutes, they placed him in handcuffs. No shouting, no struggle, just the steady, quiet collapse of someone who thought he had more time than he did. They listed the charges: attempted elder exploitation, identity fraud, and potential harm based on the evidence gathered. He didn't say a word as they led him out the door. The house fell silent once they were gone. The documents sat untouched on the table, the yellow tabs still pointing to signatures that would never be signed. The danger that had been building around me for weeks finally broke, leaving the room still but heavy. The days that followed moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each one marked by paperwork, statements, and steady voices explaining the next step. My attorney gathered everything: screenshots, forged forms, the recordings from both the waiter and the girlfriend, the login logs from my bank, and the doctor's report. He assembled it all into a file thick enough to feel heavy even before you touched it. When he submitted the formal charges, he did it with the calm precision of someone who had handled enough cases to recognize a clear pattern. He didn't dramatize anything. He simply laid out the truth. The bank called me in for a private meeting. They walked me through every attempted breach, each failed login, every flagged request. They placed permanent fraud alerts on all my accounts and set up additional layers of security only accessible in person. The representative apologized more than once, though none of it was the bank's fault. She told me someone had been determined to get in, far more determined than most fraud cases she'd seen. Hearing her say it aloud brought a quiet confirmation to everything I'd already come to understand. My doctor filed his own documentation. He explained the unauthorized requests in clear, clinical language, leaving no room for doubt about how dangerous the changes would have been if they'd gone through. He gave me a printed copy for my records and told me he was relieved the request had been caught in time. He said most patients never learn who made those changes until it's too late. His steady expression softened for just a moment, enough to show he understood how personal this situation was. The formal charges against my nephew were announced at the end of the week: attempted elder exploitation, identity fraud, medical interference, financial manipulation, and a restraining order that kept him a long, measured distance from me. There was no public drama, no scenes, no reporters. Everything happened inside offices, behind closed doors, the way these things should. He stayed in custody while the case moved forward, leaving a quiet space in my life where his presence had once been. His girlfriend provided a full statement to authorities. She told them everything she knew, every message, every conversation, every moment she'd felt something was wrong but had been afraid to speak. They granted her protection as well, ensuring she wouldn't face retaliation or pressure. She called me afterward, her voice thin but steady, telling me she hoped this would finally put an end to everything. I told her she had done the right thing. She didn't reply, but I heard a breath on the line that sounded like someone who hadn't taken a real one in weeks. When things quieted, I was left with the part no one else could help me with, the weight of what he'd tried to do. I sat in my living room one evening, the house dim except for a single lamp, looking at a family photo on the shelf. My nephew was in it, younger, smiling, his hand on my shoulder. I stared at the photo for a long time, not with anger, but with a kind of tired sorrow. There are betrayals you see coming, and then there are the ones that shift the ground beneath your feet. The authorities I worked with told me I'd done the right thing, that recognizing early signs had prevented something much worse. They said most people in my position ignore those first warnings. I didn't feel proud or even reassured. I felt relieved, in a quiet way, that I had listened to the unease instead of dismissing it. Relief didn't erase the betrayal, but it settled into my chest like a necessary truth. By the end of the week, the house finally exhaled. The danger wasn't hovering around the edges anymore. The system had stepped in, the facts were recorded, and the next steps were in motion. All that remained was learning how to live with the echo of what nearly happened and the knowledge of how close it had come. The house felt different once everything settled, quieter in a way that didn't press on my chest anymore. I started rebuilding my routines piece by piece, not rushing anything. Morning coffee at the kitchen table, short walks to stretch the stiffness in my legs, sorting my own mail, taking my time with the small tasks I'd nearly handed over to someone else. I tightened the boundaries around my life, not out of fear, but out of respect for what those boundaries meant. The independence I'd taken for granted had become something I guarded with a clearer sense of purpose. Some nights, I found myself thinking about how danger doesn't always arrive with shouting or broken windows. Sometimes it walks through the front door wearing a familiar face, speaking with concern, asking if you need help. That was the part that stayed with me. The way real threats can hide inside gestures that look like care. My nephew hadn't started with malice. He'd started with access. A little trust here, a little convenience there. The shift had been so slow, I didn't see it until I was already standing too close to the edge. Knowing that changed the way I moved through the world and the way I listened to my own instincts. If anyone in my age group ever asked for advice, I'd keep it simple. Guard your documents. Keep your information to yourself. When someone insists on helping with your money or health, pause long enough to ask why. Not out of suspicion, but out of respect for your own safety. And if something feels off, if a sentence, a look, a small request makes the room feel colder than it should, don't ignore that feeling. It's your mind trying to protect the life you've spent decades building. As the weeks passed, I found a steadier kind of peace settling into my days. I didn't feel victorious or angry. I felt grounded. I kept thinking about my late wife and the way she always said the hardest choices were the ones that kept you honest with yourself. Protecting my home, my health, my future. It wasn't just about me. It was about honoring the life we had built together. The values she carried with her until the end. I didn't let someone undo that. That brought a quiet strength I hadn't felt in a long time. Every now and then, I would drive past the restaurant where everything had started, not to relive anything, just to remind myself how small moments can shift the direction of an entire life. A waiter with a steady hand and a good conscience had made a choice that day. A simple decision in a quiet booth, and that recording had become the thread that pulled the truth into the light. It struck me how easily it could have gone unnoticed, how easily danger could have slipped past me without that one small act. I didn't look for closure in any dramatic sense. I didn't search for reasons or try to make sense of what my nephew had become. Some things don't have clean explanations. Some choices people make are theirs alone to carry. What mattered was that I had stopped it before it went further, that I had trusted my instincts even when I didn't want to believe them. In the end, I learned something I wish I hadn't needed to. Learn this late in life, but I'm grateful I learned it in time. Growing older isn't the danger. Living without caution is. The real threat comes from trusting the wrong people simply because they share your blood. And sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is listen to the quiet warnings he almost talked himself out of hearing.